Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Martin, and tonight we are talking about the men of letters versus the British men of letters. And what would they think of each other? What would they make of each other? How would this have worked out if we'd have been able to spend more time, story-wise, with both sides? But first, let's start with having our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Elektra.
Hi, I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm an editor and a writer, and you can find my latest story in Alternate Peace, edited by Joshua Parmentier and Stephen Silver.
Nice. Lola?
I'm Lola Laracy. I'm a writer. You can go to my website, lolalaracy.com, and see just about everything. Well, not everything. I mean, lady has some honesty, but you know what I mean.
Carole?
I'm Carole Stokes. I'm a fanfic writer, and you can find my fanfic on AO3 under firesign10, and you can find me on Twitter at true_firesign10.
And I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more as Gail Martin. And as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal, romance. And you can find me pretty much everywhere by looking for one or both of those names. So let's, jump into this feat first. We've got the men of letters, which we didn't get to see a whole lot of, and the British men of letters, which you could argue we may have gotten to see too much of. But we never really saw them cross over with each other because all of the American men of letters were dead, except for Sam and Dina's legacies. Mm-hmm. If they had coexisted in the same place and time, what do you think would have happened? In other words, if Henry Winchester had run into his counterparts at the British men of letters or vice versa. Anybody want to jump in start on that thread?
It's certainly an interesting concept. One of the difficulties right off the bat is the time difference, because of course the American men of letters we're talking are back in the 50s, arguably a somewhat kinder time, at least for the normal people, not the hunters and stuff. And we don't really have any idea what the British men of letters was like at that same time. So we can't compare them, apples to apples. The British men of letters that we see are the up-to-date current ones. So they have technology, they've evolved into their own thing, into their own being, and their own, have their own concepts. I was actually rewatching an episode today where the British invasion, and they're really bloodthirsty. The British men of letters are just far more brutal than the Americans. The Americans were like, watch, learn, observe, didn't like to work with the hunters all that much, but gave them information and willingly seceded the gory stuff, the physical aspect to them, in which we see when Henry meets his sons, and he's like, oh my gosh, my sons are hunters, the family name. And but the British men of letters had no problem being killers as well as they were actually less learning and observing and more my way or the highway, and I'll mow anybody else down. When we first met Tony, Lady Antonia Bevel, and we think, wow, she's, a loose nut. But come to realize later, as we see these, meet more people, and we meet Dr. Hess and all of this, that she's not unique. And in fact, she is the norm. Whereas for the American men of letters, they would have been like, holy guacamole, what is going on here? I think they would have been very, very shocked by the British men of letters ethics, or the lack thereof, and how they went about achieving their goals.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I'll agree. They were absolutely ruthless for the most part. There was also a scale issue. Everything that they seem to have a very upper class British attitude about things. We will do things this way and we will be rigid about it and we will do it exactly the way we're going to do it. And if you deviate from the way we want to do it, we will just end you.
Right.
And that's it. And we've got everything, we've got all the ports and all the airports and everything marked off so that monsters can't come in. And why haven't you taken care of that here in America? And they don't seem to understand the scale of Britain versus the United States, where, face it, England is about the size of New Jersey.
Yeah.
And they can't comprehend just how large North America is and how much ground there is to cover. And it's the scale of the two countries is just very, very different, and things are done differently in the two places. And they just can't seem to, well, we're just going to wipe all the vampires out of the Midwest, nest by nest. And they'll just stay where they're supposed to be, and we will go get them, and nothing will move while we're doing that. They just can't comprehend that other things move while they're doing it.
Yeah.
Lots of moving pieces.
Yeah, that's a great point, is that what works in a small territory does not work in a large territory. I don't know how many people are employed by TSA, but they barely cover the airports as it is. Imagine if they were all men of letters. You'd have to have, what, hundreds of thousands of them? It's hard to keep something like that very secret after a while.
And all the borders, could you imagine having to put sigils on every port and I mean, you can just roll up to any town on the East Coast and have your boat and come in. You can't put a sigil on every, inlet.
And every tree along the Canadian border.
Right.
I mean,
It's impossible.
I think one other thing that they severely underestimated was, as Elektra said, that they're used to a certain class of people. Now, Mick, admittedly, they found on the street, but they raised him and educated him and pretty much brought him up to that class. Everything seems very, poshy kind of. And I think the British are much more used to, here's traditions and here's how we do this, even in their regular life. And they accept that. America, not so much. America is a land of fierce individualism and people who all have their own ideas and their own thoughts and have no problem expressing them and talking back to people who are like, well, you're going to do this. And they're like, no, I don't think so. So here, and especially hunters are never, they're all like individuals. They're all, I'm my own person and maybe I'll work with another hunter here and there, but they're all very, very individualistic. And the last thing they want to do is have anybody coming in and telling them how they're going to do stuff and who they're going to, kowtow to and all of this. And I think that was a concept completely foreign to the elders of the British men of letters.
Well, the American men of letters were basically a lodge. It was someplace guys went after work to hang out with their buddies, and it was a club. It was a thing they did, but they also had jobs, because there isn't an upper class here of people of leisure who can do this kind of thing as a hobby full time. In Britain, they trained them young at Hogwarts, basically, at Kendrick's, which was a boarding school. And they had mostly upper class kids that were sent there, presumably by parents who knew about it. And they trained them up really good. And they killed approximately half of them, which made no sense whatsoever. I still don't get that. I mean, there was the whole Kingsman thing where, the final task in the Kingsman is they try and get you to kill your pet dog. And if you're not familiar with Kingsman, it's just a task to see if you will follow orders, and it's a blank. You don't actually kill your dog. And indeed, they could have tried to get them to do something like that, where they didn't actually have to kill them. Because I'm trying to explain how they tell all these wealthy families, oh, by the way, your son, daughter didn't make it. They're one of the dead ones.
I guess they're the spares.
And they train up all these kids.
Maybe they told them, maybe they said,
kill
we're gonna
them?
ship them off to America.
Yeah.
It seems a waste of time and energy. I mean, if you want to fail them out because they're not up to snuff, fine. But apparently some of the kids they knocked off were actually pretty good.
Or have them kill a human-like monster to prove that they aren't going to lose their nerve if it comes down to that. You know, somebody who looks like a human, which, you know, is going to hit all those social triggers. You could do that.
Bring in some werewolves.
Yeah.
Or vampires.
Or something, yeah.
That makes far more sense than kill one of your friends. Why put the money into, or even bring in some urchins off the street? I mean, why are you killing people you've trained?
Kill the irregulars, not Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, especially since after World War I, which really, you know, decimated the ruling class in England, they don't have that many of them to spare anymore.
Yeah, and some of them don't have the money.
Them that bothered me.
Pardon? I'm sorry, I didn't catch what you said, Elektra.
It was the training. They put training into these kids and then killed off some of them.
It didn't make any sense except as a dramatic device to let's show how awful these people are. And I thought it was interesting that the British men of letters had their own prep school, which the American men of letters apparently did not. So there was, how did they get the training? Was it on the job? Did they get mentored? Did they, you know, come in for weekend classes? Honey, I'm going to the lodge. I've got to, you know.
I got the sense, I mean, much like, I think this happened with Henry, but then I think this is what Henry would have planned to do with John, was that then bring their own children, start bringing them in for training and everything like that. And let them start learning so that by the time they had reached manhood, they were ready to take on the mantle, you know, of the duties of a man of letters. And certainly that's a big, I've certainly seen that in fanfic quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly a logical kind of thing to go, that you at least have that self-sustaining as they procreated themselves, it was their children, and hence the legacies. You know, John would have come in, and then if John had been there, he would have brought Sam and Dean in, and you know, they would learn at their father's knees, kind of thing.
Well,
but that's an interesting difference in that there was then the expectation that the men of letters would get married and have families, where with the British men of letters, they had to pull from outside because that didn't seem, that idea of having a semi-normal life outside of the organization didn't seem to exist.
Although Antonia had a son.
That's
we
true.
Never saw him, and we never found out how she got him, but she had a son, and she was very mumsy, you know, she was very affectionate to him and everything, and then, you know, turned around to torture Sam.
Well, when they weren't sent off to other countries, which seemed not very often, the British men of letters, everything was pretty settled there. So they could do stuff and have families.
So here's a question, you know, they only talked about protecting Britain. What about the rest of the Commonwealth? Did they not protect Canada or Australia? I mean,
well,
both of those would have given them scale.
Well, we know that there were some extended operations. They had a map showing other parts of the world.
Okay.
And we know the American men of letters had operatives in other countries too, because Eileen Leahy's father
Mhm.
was
Yeah,
elsewhere when he was killed.
It's true.
Mhm, mhm.
So there was some expansion. Remember too, Henry died the night of his initiation, or died. Henry came forward in time the
Yeah.
night of his initiation. So they were studying before they were initiated, and he knew a fair
Mhm,
amount.
mhm.
So they may just be looking for, the American men of letters may have been looking for likely people and bringing them in and teaching them the way that Sam studies the lore.
Mhm.
They may have just been finding likely people and teaching, bringing them into the lodge and having them learn from the library and giving them assignments. I want you to read this book,
Mhm, mhm.
do this thing, and seeing who had the aptitude before you initiate them into the greater mysteries. Isn't that how lodges work anyway?
There's certainly a trend like that from everybody I knew who grew up with like the Masons, because that tended to run in families. And I was going to say, it's interesting though, whoever said lodge, the British men of letters culture seemed to be much more like the Victorian members only gentlemen's club, not the kind of gentlemen's club with stripper
Yeah.
pole, but the very posh
Cigar and whiskey.
The club chairs and the butler with the brandy and
Yeah.
like you'd see in Sherlock Holmes, where
Yeah.
you had to be invited, which means you had to be of a certain group. And it was kind of like a big bar and library where I guess men could get away from their wives. But it was very secret. And yet, what, they went to drink and read? Where if you think of the lodges in America, the Elk, the Moose, all of those, they tend to be very working class. That's not where the Carnegies and the Fricks went. They did have some of their own clubs, but not nearly as much. The Elk and the Moose and all of those were very much a blue collar kind of thing. And that's, and yet the bunker almost harkens the other way. So it's kind of an interesting mishmash. We had my senior prom at the local Moose Lodge.
Okay.
No, the local Elk Lodge. And I remember that because they put a strobe light between the antlers on the stuffed elk head on the wall. And we had to have a moment of silence at midnight. Imagine this, whole hundreds of teenagers. And we had to have a moment of silence at midnight for all the dead elks. And we were not, looking back, tremendously respectful about that because we kept making jokes to each other about hunting season. And of course they meant members, not the animals. Of course, it would have been fun if it had been a Moose Lodge with Sam. But
yeah. I lived there was an Elks Club behind my house. And I think my dad went to that. I just remember going to their swimming pool. That's all I remember.
Now, aren't those kinds of lodges, the American working class type ones there, like you said, aren't they also much more aimed at like civic and charity work and things like that, whereas the British ones were, like you said, we're going to enjoy our wealth.
Yeah.
In this serene
Depends on the
atmosphere of
lodge
cigars and port. But the American
it-
lodges are about let's do good in our community.
Like the Shriners, right? Isn't it
Mhm.
like the Shriners? Yeah, and their hats and everything.
It's
Yeah, 'cause they're,
different
the
from
lions,
community to community.
Yeah.
As somebody who grew up in the lodge and belonged as a kid to the Triangle, which is the kids Masons group, the girls and the boys of the BMOL. Yeah, it depends on your community and how much stuff you do, but it's mostly a social club.
Okay.
As a way that you can get together with other like-minded people. And since people bring in their friends to join the lodge, some of it is family. I mean, my mother was a star and my dad was a Mason. Some of it is, I want to bring my friends in to join so that we can all hang out together and do this thing.
Okay.
So if the group in your area are wealthier than another area, you will have more hoity-toity stuff going on. It depends. You will see different lodges do different things. Whether we did a charity dinner every year, but that was pretty much it. Mostly it was socializing with the people in the lodge.
Well, and I think the lodges were largely, the big lodge movement, I think, was largely a post-World War II effect where people, that moment in time, people had jobs that could sustain the family on one income and free time because they had unionized hours in many cases. So that was the grand height of bowling and bridge groups and the lodges. And I think it has steadily declined as people just don't have the time, let alone, you know, the inclination. But it was very much a product of its time, which really would have been the height of when Henry was getting initiated.
And we don't know, do we, when the British, not the British ones, the American men of letters really began, right? We don't really have any idea, you know, did they start in colonial times? Did they start, you know, world after, you know, in the Depression? I mean, we don't know when they started, really.
Well, we know they were there in the
British.
20s because of the babe in the flapper dress.
Right.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
And
But I'll
then
bet
And
British
the
ones
fact that they were around for Baum's daughter, Dorothy.
Yeah. That was like 30s. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So
they were at least-
so they were pretty well established then.
Mhm.
I wonder
We
if
don't know
they
how
came
far
over
back
from
it goes.
Britain. Me neither.
I mean, do we count Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter as a potential?
We could. I mean, it could be something
Only-
like that.
Only if
That's
the
a
Brits
different mythos, I think.
yeah, only if
think
the Brits get to count, you know, Jane Austen's Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies.
That was a good one too. I like those.
So it's probably a mix where they probably brought in some new members as legacies and then other new members that they found, like you said, the like-minded people, and probably from both those avenues were able to continue their membership enough to keep going, you know, until of course they were all killed.
The
Yeah.
other thing that struck me as very difficult to believe, you know, Sam confronts the British men of letters about where were you during the apocalypse? And they were like, well, the old men didn't want to get involved. I'm sorry, how do you not get involved in a planet annihilating situation? I don't care how good your panic room is. Apocalypse,
Is everybody,
that kind of definition.
unless they're just really that arrogant, it will not affect us.
I think they had to say something because clearly there wasn't anything. And, you know, really back then there was no men of letters in the writer's eye. So I think they
That's
had to
true.
do something to say, yeah, well, we waited
It
that
was
way.
just the colonies. They're not our problem.
Mhm. It's across the pond.
Train themselves
Yeah.
and not come to the old world.
Maybe they thought they had enough sigils and wards and stuff,
Yeah.
but there was like a bubble around them.
It
It
was
was-
a salt ocean, and so nobody wanted to cross.
Maybe. Yeah.
Well, what I found really interesting was the American men of letters definitely had that attitude about hunters were like subhuman practically.
Yeah.
They knew about them and they worked with certain select hunters that they gave information to. Whereas the British men of letters, I mean, Ketch is practically a hunter. I mean,
He's an assassin.
very military
Yeah.
and he just goes out and kills stuff.
Yeah.
But you've got Mick and Mick, you know, couldn't shoot something if it was standing there in front of him. He couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. There was all of these weird inconsistencies with the Brits. They were absolutely, utterly ruthless. They were perfectly willing to do magic, but they were hands-on about some things and not other things. It was like, oh, right, we need somebody killed. We'll just get Ketch to do that. But he went to school with them.
Well, they probably had their different strata of, you know, you could be on the assassin track, or you could be on the administrative track, or you could be, you know, because you also had Ms. Watt, who was also quite a fighter and killer.
Mhm.
And
Probably a spells and sorcery track.
right. And so they were probably much more specialized within there. Wasn't there somebody who was even like, oh my gosh, I finally saw a vampire, and they were like, what? You know, or when once again, British invasion, and Dr. Hess sends over her #1 guy who was this blonde, you know, simp, you know, with the fancy hair, and he's all like, oh, and you could tell he had never dealt with a monster ever, you know, that he was strictly administrative. So they probably just had all their different, you know, functions, and
And
They
that
didn't
could,
have monsters in Britain anymore.
yeah, that's probably why. They warded them all off. And as far as Ketch being an assassin, that could be a class thing too, because if he was brought off the street, they could have already kind of set him at that level, like you're one of us, but not really.
we don't know where he came from though. Mick came off.
Oh, it was Mick who came
Right,
off the
Mick who
street.
came off the
Okay.
street.
Mick was
I
a pickpocket.
I get
Yeah.
them mixed up. I know what they look like, but I
Yeah.
get their names mixed up.
Mhm.
Okay.
Ketch is really, he's a catch. He's pretty hot.
He was pretty handsome,
Yeah.
except for when he was like killing people. I like
Ketch was sufficiently acceptable that him and Tony apparently had a thing while they were in school.
Well, I think Ketch had a thing with anybody he felt like it. I mean, look at him and Mary, you
yeah,
know,
that's true.
and Mary's like, now don't get any ideas about this. And Ketch is like, I'm not built for that. You know,
That was just a little weird, but okay.
it was
Yeah.
a little weird, but you know, heat of battle and all. And don't forget, it had been a really, really, really long time for Mary.
What was the comment in the one with that Hunter and Bobby's ghost, Last Night on Earth, or was it
Oh,
Foxhole? She had a lot of foxholes.
oh, yeah. What's her name? Annie?
Yeah, where
I want to
she
say
slept
Annie Hall, but I know it wasn't Annie Hall, but it was,
Sam, Dean, and Bobby.
yeah.
Oh, that's
Sam's like,
right.
well, I was soulless.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the British men of letters obviously had their own tactical organization, but I'm not sure how the American men of letters, if they kind of worked on an Angie's list of hunting on, you know, we only work with approved hunters from the list. It goes back to, it's a big country. So we only ever saw one other chapter house. How many chapter houses were there?
We never got to find out.
No.
Talk about your lost storyline.
I mean, there should be at least, I mean, there 50 states. Well, back then, I don't know if Hawaii was a state yet, but you know, at least 48, I would think, one per state or at least one per region.
Yep.
So,
I mean,
Yeah, there should have been a bunch, and her
yeah.
Abaddon killing the however many 6 or 7 of them she got during that initiation should not have killed the whole organization.
I know. That's
I
kind
think
of,
that was a thread the writers lost. They decided it was going to be this one group, and then they realized it was probably national, and they never said anything about it.
Right. They just let it go.
Well, the other possibility was that Abaddon was just rolling through them one at a time.
Yeah.
I
Or
guess
perhaps
so.
she even sent other demons.
Yeah.
I mean, at
That's a
that
good
point, when
point.
she's rocking and rolling, man, she's probably got her own demons that she can be like, now go everywhere, and you know, like the flying monkeys, go. And
Yeah, go.
you know.
And they do it, they hit it all at the same time.
'cause
And
there certainly had to be. I mean, even in Buffy, you have more than one Hellmouth.
that's
You
true.
So,
That
so
is
I can't
true.
believe there wouldn't be more than, you know, at least a couple of dozen of chapter houses, and those were probably all had, you know, stories, and there's unexplored for either canon or in fanfic, you know, to explore those unknown and unstated houses and people.
Well, the other thing that I thought was interesting is the bunker is set up, and maybe this is part of a Cold War thinking. I mean, it had its own hospital. It had, it was designed to be lived in, not just let's come over on Wednesday night and do some spells and then play cards. So was that just in case, sort of like a Cold War bomb shelter, or because obviously Henry had a family, so he wasn't living there. It wasn't like people were taking monastic orders. So
It
Was
wasn't
that
where
the-
they had their meetings either.
mm-mm.
It was where they kept all of the lore and all of the artifacts and everything else. And it was very centrally located. It's the exact
Right.
center of the US.
That's true.
So
could have
it,
been-
it was the repository of all
Good
knowledge.
Right. And also then command headquarters, that if something big was happening, they could retreat to and have the map room and the
That's a good point.
resources, you know, to deal with a larger scale issue.
So I
Because
think
what
it
it
is their retreat.
What it really reminded me of is I've been in Churchill's bunkers in England
Oh.
that after the war was over, they just shut the doors and walked away and left everything exactly where it was, down to the blotters on the desks.
Wow.
But it has very much the same feel
Mhm.
in terms of the underground facility and the dormitory and the kitchen and being completely
Self-sustaining.
self-sufficient. Yeah. So I wonder if that
It
partially
looked like it was
inspired
set up for like a couple of people to man at all times. So
Mhm.
that there was, but they all left for the initiation and no one ever came back.
Mm.
But it
Well,
was,
and they
it was
hadn't-
intended to have somebody guarded at all times.
Yeah, for continuation. Just like they say that, you know, there's one person of government who sets out a big meeting, so there'll be the
Right.
the continuation of government. Yes,
Right.
I watched that TV show.
well, they had Mrs. Butters.
That's true.
And then
Dorothy.
she finally, instead of using her awesome power to like protect them, she finally says, well, I've waited long enough. I'm just gonna power down. Which I'm
And
thinking,
wait,
yeah, because I know she got brainwashed by Cuthbert Sinclair, but I'm still thinking that she might have been a worthy adversary to Abaddon.
That's a good point.
She had a lot of power, that's for sure. Didn't she? She went up against Jack, didn't she?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
she smoothied him first.
She smoothied it.
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and got them all like I will obey or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, she
I
rooted
remember.
She was very smart,
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
but she was also being held prisoner to some extent.
Mhm.
Yeah. And she was loyal to the bunker, you know, and not
Mhm.
loyal to people, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah, there was a real strong Stockholm syndrome thing going on there because she was loyal to the men of letters, but they're the
Yeah.
ones who kidnapped her and programmed her. So that was
It is
another thread there. Just like Cuthbert Sinclair's underground invisible lair. What became of it? What happened to all of his collections? What happened to all of the artifacts and the weapons and he had a zoo of cryptids. What happened to them when they killed?
Jesse's living there now.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I can deal with that. That's good headcanon.
Oh man.
They should have done a whole series about this, set like in the 40s or something before everyone went kaput.
Now that would have been a good
Mhm.
spinoff. That would have been
Oh.
interesting.
We'd get Jensen dressed like he was with Elliot Ness in that
Yep.
episode. I think we
That
could
was
all get
good.
behind that.
Yes.
Yeah.
think
Oh
so.
yeah.
That would be nice.
Yeah,
And
take
we'll-
a number, we'll get in line.
Mhm. That would be nice.
Oh
Oh,
man.
and
Hey.
that's it. Huh?
What's that line about hate to see you leave, love to watch you go?
Love to watch you walk
You just
away.
said that in
Yeah.
Walker. Yep. Yep.
That's another thing I was thinking, like, what if the men of letters hadn't fallen and John and Dean and Sam had, you know, grown up to be part of that? And I was thinking, what would Dean be like? And I started thinking about that. Remember when they came in from an alternate universe and Dean looked like he was off the cover of GQ?
Oh, the Rich Chesters.
The Richchesters, yeah. I think they would probably be like that. Dean would be like, this is too dirty for me. I need someone to wipe this chair off before I sit down. He would be totally fussy and what am I looking at? You know, what do I look like? Look in the mirror and stuff.
And the
That was a
Mandarin.
very strange dimension they came from.
Mhm.
Definitely the
Various
GQ
dimensions.
dimension. Like,
That was
And no
hilarious.
socks. No socks apparently
Yeah.
exist.
of course not. They don't
No
need
socks, but several airplanes and pilots,
Mm-hmm.
that. Mhm. And
but
probably a
little
lot of
tiny
cologne.
cars,
Mm-hmm.
which must have been very uncomfortable for tall people.
Yeah. Well, speaking of cars, the bunker has that entire collection
No, we
of,
never saw that much after they introduced it. How awesome is that?
and why did they have it? I mean, it did seem like they were kind of halfway trying to be a social club and let's also research monsters and be all scholarly like, but you don't need those motorcycles if you're being scholarly.
But in the end, they were a bunch of nerds,
That's true.
This is
Maybe
true.
they liked
and
it.
they
yeah.
sat around and read books.
And
They were
the-
probably reading James Bond and said, "We need that."
and I can also see probably that, there were times where one of them might have to like dash off here or dash off there to go bring an artifact or, take care of something, messengers or something, that certainly the motorcycles would have been useful for anyway. Yeah, there is certainly a lot of rough edges once you
Mhm.
start poking at this, where they kind of had this really interesting idea. I won't say it was half baked. We'll say it was 3/4 baked.
It
Mhm.
could have been fleshed out some
It
more.
could have been, yeah. But they, once again, with, breaking the continuity of writers and the writers not necessarily following the continuity of the season.
Well, once you build the bunker, it's harder to put more stuff in it. So they decided to put a whole bunch of stuff in it when they found it. They'd figure out later whether it made sense.
Yeah,
And
it
it
looked
was
cool.
always
It all
fun
looked really cool.
when they found the garage,
Yeah,
or we have a dungeon.
yeah.
Those were always great moments.
Mhm.
It's like the TARDIS on Doctor Who, because sometimes like there's a swimming pool. There's a swimming pool in the TARDIS, and you can find any clothes you want, and so it's like if it's needed, you find it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
Or all
because
the artifacts that they're not sure what they do.
Mhm.
Hopefully they don't touch them too much if they're not sure. Don't touch it.
That always made me think of Stargate Atlantis a little bit, because they have all the alien artifacts and a
Mhm.
lot of it is harmless to people because it only works if you have the gene. But if
Mhm.
you have the gene,
Everything lights up, and all of a sudden you're out of the ocean and in the air, and you're like,
Right.
"Where are we going?"
or you're wearing a brooch that puts you in this protective shield, but then you realize you can't eat or drink.
Right, and you're like, "Get it off me!" Ah.
So yeah, you best be careful what you're picking up. That's not just a little box. It could be
Very
anything.
powerful.
Anything.
Well, and there have been some very entertaining fanfics about, grabbing something off a shelf without reading the label too closely and what ensues, which,
Absolutely.
in a way, the hunters did the same kind of thing with their storage units. It was a very rough and tumble solution. They didn't build these very elaborate, comfortable chapter houses, but they had all these storage units strung across the country filled with, and John wasn't the only one doing it, because
I gotta leave the stuff somewhere. I'll just leave it in Buffalo.
Yeah.
Buffalo, well, it can't do too much damage if it gets out, if it's in Buffalo. I mean,
Chances are it'll be under 2 feet of snow.
No, right.
That's
Right.
a good point. Well, they only go there in the summer.
You got to have some place to put your cursed boxes in. You
It's
can't
true.
leave them in the trunk of the car.
but that's such a that is such a hunter mentality way of doing this. It's not it's scarce resources. What can we do? Well, we can't build an underground bunker with all the bells and whistles, but we can run a storage unit in perpetuity.
There's a used store around the corner.
I still wanted to find out what that cursed teddy bear did. The one that Sam kept picking up that they got from the guy who stole the other hunters.
I thought didn't they say it had something to do with John Gacy or something?
No, that was the cigar box.
Oh,
That's scary. Ooh.
I don't think they ever said about the teddy
Oh.
bear. Sam
Just
just
that it was
wouldn't leave him
cursed.
alone. And it had something to do with pulling the string because
Right,
the guy told him
right.
not to do it. But
Maybe it's like that. Maybe it's like that doll in Twilight Zone, where it's like,
yeah,
I'm
They
going to
end
kill
up with
you.
storage units full of cursed objects. I just didn't think there were that many cursed objects around.
There are people who do that. I mean, like I don't know how true it is, but they collect cursed objects, and they're like TV shows about it. Like
Yeah.
the Annabelle doll, the doll that Annabelle's based on. They have that. I don't want to go there.
Well, I don't know if it was all cursed objects. It looked like they also had some extra weapons stored there.
Yeah. And probably what little memorabilia, like he had Sam soccer trophy.
Yeah.
And, so once again, there's really no place for them to keep memorabilia at. A few hunters have, for instance, Bobby actually had a big house, but most hunters don't have that kind of thing. And
they're nomadic.
Even they are going to have things here and there. And they say, let's just tuck it in there.
Like lock boxes or something. Secret spaces.
Monsters can burn your house down, so yeah.
Yeah,
It's
put
true.
it somewhere the monsters can't find. If I did that, I would forget where I put it. I'd be like, is it in Florida or Alabama? I always forget. Or is it
That's
in
what your journal is
Alabama?
for.
Yeah, that's great.
It does make you wonder, though, with the death toll of hunters, how many abandoned storage units are out there. And unless they paid a long time in advance, which,
That's a
hunting
good
didn't really
point.
pay well,
Mhm.
those get auctioned off fairly quickly when you stop paying the bill. So now you've got a situation where they're auctioning off all these cursed objects because Hunter Joe got blown away.
Pawn Stars, the Supernatural Edition.
Mhm.
That would have been an awesome episode or something, or fic or something. Like one day there's an auction, at the storage space, and somebody gets. It doesn't even have to be a cursed object. It could just be like all these monster tools, hunting tools, and they're like, "What the hell?" And
Y'all are giving.
Most of them are pretty ordinary. They're guns and
That's
the
true.
occasional machete, but
That's true.
And then you have your Hand of Glory, as one does.
That's true. Book of the Damned, Book of the Dead, all that stuff. Yeah.
but a lot of them, a blade that's got a silver edge or something is not going to stand out
That's
as
true.
being that weird.
That's true.
They just won't notice.
That's true. They'll just think they're a serial killer. Like, who the heck is this?
Well, folks, believe it or not, we have blown through our time. So from not being sure we had enough to talk about to finding plenty, I never really doubted that we'd be able to fill the time. So before we finish up here, let's go around again and just remind people where they can find you online. And I'm going to go around backwards now from Carole.
I write fanfic. It's all posted at on AO3, Archive of Our Own, under the name Firesign 10. I write all different flavors, so mind the tags. And on Twitter, I am true_Firesign 10.
Great. Lola?
I'm Lola Laracy. You can find me at Twitter at Lola Laracy, and Facebook. I have a page that's Lola Laracy, but I also use my real name. I won't say that here. You'll figure it out if you really want to.
Cool. Elektra?
Elektra Hammond, you can find me at untilmidnight.com, and that's got links to everything.
And you can find me at gailzmartin.com or morganbryce.com and all the social media sites based on that, or you can just look for me here at Continual. And folks, thank you so much to our panelists for being here and having a great discussion. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up here on Continual, so we'll see you online.